a hub of activity at the intersection of Friedrichstrasse and Zimmerstrasse, and for Berliners, they know this corner as Checkpoint Charlie. Hi, I'm Matt, and welcome to another edition of Borders on Budgets. On this episode, we're going to take a condensed look of the history of the Cold War at the Black Box exhibit located at the intersection of Checkpoint Charlie. And yes, this spot here, this was where the Berlin Wall fell 30 years ago.
Seems like this should be on the Blair Witch.
Next episode.
A reminder, Borders on Budgets.
While this piece of the Berlin Wall is not in its original spot, the wall in fact did run right through here, separating West Berlin from East Berlin. And it is appropriate that at this point that there is an exhibition on the Cold War history, particularly with an emphasis on the role Berlin had during this 45-year period. The Cold War begins almost as soon as the Second World War ends, between the victorious United States, England, France, and the Soviet Union. These historical powers divided Germany for both security and punitive reasons. It became Berlin, though, which proved a thorny issue, as the historical German capital lay well within the Soviet sector, and it was territory the Americans, French, and British were not ready to cede to an advancing Red Army. One of the first flare-ups in the Cold War was the Berlin blockade, as Western Germany and West Berlin were beginning to rebuild following the war using American economic aid. This put the Soviets in a distinct disadvantage because it was East Germany and East Berlin that was not able to rebuild itself. The Soviets took it upon themselves to block access to West Berlin through the rail, canals, and roads in June of 1948. In order to avoid having Berlin choked off economically, Western allies launched what was then the Berlin Airlift, with 280,000 flights occurring over an 11-month period at a rate of about 1 per minute. 2.5 million tons of supplies were sent from the Western Germany, controlled by the Americans, British, and French, over the airspace of the Soviet-controlled Eastern Germany, and thus kept Berlin afloat. Eventually, the Soviets did release the blockade without any military intervention. The first Cold War conflict, pitting the democratic allies against the communist bloc, was in Korea beginning in 1950. On June 25, 1950, North Korea crosses the 38th parallel into South Korea and quickly overwhelms the Korean peninsula, including the South Korean capital of Seoul. The United States, through the United Nations, responds, sending 250,000 troops to the aid of the South Koreans. By 1951, the United States and UN troops pushed the North Koreans back into their country and near to the Chinese border. China responds by sending 250,000 of its own troops, thus pushing the United States and the United Nations troops back across the 38th, and for 2 years the war became a stalemate, eventually resulting in the 1953 ceasefire, keeping the 38th parallel as the original demarcation line. During the 1950s, uprisings in East Germany, Poland, and Hungary showed cracks in the socialist empire. After the Second World War, 2.5 million East Germans fled the Soviet Eastern German sector for the Allied Western German sector, and the Soviets were not pleased with this human capital exodus. It was on August 13th, 1961, that the erection of the Berlin Wall began, and by the end of the day, the city had been physically separated and divided. Through the 1960s, the Americans and the Soviets underwent a significant military buildup. In response to Western missiles placed in Turkey near to the Soviet Union border, the Soviets responded by wanting to place their own missiles in Cuba, in America's backyard. With the new Cuban leader, Fidel Castro, more than happy to accept Soviet military aid, the world faced a nuclear showdown in October 1962, when the Americans, under then-President John F. Kennedy, said to the Soviets to send your missiles back, and the Soviets, under the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev, initially refused, although eventually the Soviets did back down, though needless to say, it was a tense period in international relations. With the Iron Curtain stalemating military activities in Europe, throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, all international affairs and incidents were seen through the eyes of a Cold War, whether it was in Vietnam, the Middle East and Africa, or Afghanistan. Everything was seen as an us versus them, communists versus Democrats battle. By the 1970s, the Americans and the Soviets were spending inordinate amounts of money on their militaries and defense budgets, whether it was through traditional manpower and supplies or on nuclear warheads. Both sides recognized that to continue down this economic path would be fruitless. So, a détente and nuclear treaties began to emerge. In 1985, United States President Ronald Reagan, who had overseen an explosion within the American Armed Forces budget, was now facing the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, who was elected to lead the Soviet Union under the new policies of glasnost and perestroika, openness and economic reform. If in 1963 President Kennedy issued the famous words "Ich bin Berliner" as he stood in front of the Berlin Wall, just as famous 24 years later, President Reagan at the wall issued the challenge to Mr. Gorbachev to tear down this wall. Within 2 years, the wall fell, although not necessarily through the efforts of Reagan or Gorbachev themselves directly. Rather, cracks within the Soviet and the socialist bloc, both domestically and internationally, in the year 1989. For example, the USSR withdrawal in Afghanistan, the democratic elections in Poland in June, also the Tiananmen Square upheaval in China. All of this eventually led to the East Berliners in November 9th, 1989, to flood the gates at Checkpoint Charlie, and thus creating the end to the Berlin Wall. This has been another edition of Borders on Budgets. A reminder, borders on budgets, long distance hikes, slices of life, not a lot of money. From the BlackBox Cold War exhibit across from Checkpoint Charlie in a unified Berlin celebrating 30 years of wall-free city status, thank you very much for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode.
Ooh! Tunnel! It's a tunnel! Oh, how neat! Woo, woo!
Did you enjoy this video? Great! Help Borders on Budgets grow. Hit the subscribe button below, leave a comment, and share this video with your friends who are interested in the Cold War.